Hello and welcome to Learn to Unpick Your Racial Bias, From Othello to Thug, How Black Men Have Been Dehumanized and Criminalized. I'm your host. My name is Sian Young. I am an award-winning international author, speaker, and coach, and I'm focused on sustainable health and well-being. But most importantly, I am loved and cherished by my Caribbean husband and my 3 children. I've studied Black history and fought for Black rights, staging protests back in the 90s. And I continue to work on my own bias as this stuff runs really deep. So some of the information you're going to see today may be upsetting, so please get support if you feel you need to after hearing all this. So let's get into it. The 1547 Vagrancy Act actually allowed for the enslavement and punishment of those who refused to submit to authority of a master. The law could be applied to the unemployed, the homeless, the sick. A master could cause the said slave to work by beating, chaining, or otherwise in such works and labour how vile soever it be, and runaways could be enslaved for life. This law was to ensure there was a clear distinction of those who had and those who had not. And this included white indentured servants, and we'll go into that in the other episodes of this series. So, the slave codes of Barbados in 1661, although Jamestown in the Americas was Britain's first overseas settlement, the Barbadian slaves got one thing that other colonies did not: the ability to have a change of clothing once a year. So slave owners, they had the right to, and the authority to chastise, whip, brand, lacerate, cripple, set on fire, and murder their slaves with no negative consequences. Legally considered property, slaves were not allowed to own property of their own. They were not allowed to assemble without the presence of a person, a white person. And in courts, if a slave was accused of a crime against a white person, they were doomed. And it was illegal to teach your slave how to read or write. Now, buck busting and seasoning plantations. Buck busting happened on plantations where they would pick the biggest black men, and the surrounding plantation owners would all come around and repeatedly rape him in front of the whole plantation to show how white supremacists were in power. This was a clear message to slave children to be good. There is even a book published by a slave owner on how to season a slave. This was to break a black man's masculinity and his spirit. This is why homophobia is so strong in Jamaica. The reason I put a picture of the police is to show that they're not raping him in public now, they're just straight out shooting unarmed black men in America. But in Britain, it's over 1,700 people have died in custody since 1990, and nobody's ever been charged, and it's predominantly black men. So we're doing it quiet in Britain. So slave breeding refers to the coercive, often violent, reproductive and sexual practices that prevent slaves from controlling their sexuality and families. This is a way to break a collection of people and set them on each other. Randolph Edmonds, 1930s, his play The Slave Breeder depicts a woman slave poisoned herself rather than have sex with another slave to produce strong slave children. The American War for Independence was the first major act of defiance to British rule over colonists. It happened over tea and taxation. The famous saying, "no taxation without representation." This is where the Boston plantation owners dressed up as Indians and dumped 342 chests of tea imported by the British East India Company into the harbour. This was the founding of America as we know it today, and why America and Britain are intrinsically linked in language, in attitudes, and in treatment of black people as they were taught by the UK. Crispus Attucks was the first person to be killed in the uprising as one of a very few free black men living under heavy restrictions. He realized that if he backed the colonists and they won, black people may get freedom too. This, I reckon, is the first Black Lives Matter movement. So in response, the British formed the West Indian Regiments to quell local uprisings. The planters and plantation owners objected because the sight of a black soldier exercising authority threatened the strict racial boundaries erected in society. Not being able to change this, they created ridiculing art to dehumanize the soldiers. So the semi-abolition of slaves. Well, this means that anybody under 6 was free. Anybody over 6 had to become indentured servants for 8 to 12 years. Meanwhile, slave owners were bailed out by the British government, and many of the slaves' future descendants would pay back for their freedom in taxes. In 2015 was the last when it was paid off. And so the slave owners got to keep their property and get paid for their property. And we're popping over to America because neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any other subject to their jurisdiction. From slave to criminal. This is on Netflix, the 13th Amendment. You should watch it. It basically shows you how there has actually been no freedom of slaves. It has been turned into criminals. If you have a criminal justice system that criminalizes you because you're black and then can enslave you and make you work for companies within that system, what's the difference? People keep saying slavery was in the past. It's not, guys. The Sasse laws in 1824. The Sasse laws authorised the arrest and punishment of suspected persons frequenting or loitering in public places with criminal intent in England. The Sasse law formed part of the Vagrancy Act of 1824. It was repealed in 1981. Does this remind you of the Vagrancy Act in 1547? It has been disproportionately applied to black people. Now, if you search for black teenagers in Google, you get the top row. If you search for white teenagers, you get the bottom row. And this article, From Brute to Thug, the Dehumanization and Criminalization of Unarmed Black Male Victims, is an article that we don't have time to go into today. But if you contact me or if you signed up to my email list, you'll get all my research links. You could follow them. And a snippet of history to look at is one day the news said thug 625 times on a Monday with regards to a black man. The language that is used to describe black men who have been killed by the law enforcement specifically, they are demonized. It's a process that happens to unarmed black men. Unlike black icons and figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X that were vilified while alive and then sanitized in death and repackaged as a suitable part of a historical narrative, these men that are being demonized are portrayed as thugs and criminals to seemingly justify their deaths, meanwhile simultaneously shifting blame away from law enforcement. There has been systematic abuse and vilification of black men for hundreds of years. This is why you have a bias in your head about them. And it's still happening. So Othello, when black men were revered and romantic in 1603 by Shakespeare, to thug in 2020. And this face here, I don't know the guy's name, but he was killed by police in the UK in police custody. There was 1,740 deaths in UK police custody, and no police officer has been charged, and black men are 2 times more likely to be the victim of this. It was in 1990. I have links to all this research. So the path has bin vagrancy laws, slave codes, dehumanizing, buck breaking, seasoning, breeding, and humiliation, criminalization, removal of rights that get gained, and media actively dehumanizing and criminalizing on global scale. And still today, deaths in police custody in the UK and deaths in police custody in Americas. And people who keep saying that America's got nothing to do with the UK, please watch the rest of this series as well. It's a 4-part series, so you can see the path, how it's intrinsically linked, and the UK taught America. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll see you in the next video, is how we got entitlement from colonialism.